When people imagine ancient Rome, they often think of grand marble villas, powerful emperors, disciplined legions, and a civilization that shaped the foundations of Western history. Roman society is remembered for its engineering, law, and military strength. Yet behind this image of greatness existed a brutal system of inequality that relied heavily on slavery. Among the most overlooked victims of this system were wet nurse slaves, women whose bodies were used to nourish the children of others, while their own lives were stripped of dignity and choice. Wet nursing was a common practice in ancient Rome, especially among wealthy families. Elite Roman women often avoided breastfeeding their own children, believing it was physically exhausting, socially inconvenient, or damaging to their appearance. Instead, enslaved women were forced to breastfeed elite infants, sometimes at the cost of their own children's survival. For the wet nurse slave, this role was not an honor. It was a deeply exploitative position that combined physical exhaustion, emotional trauma, and complete loss of bodily autonomy. Most wet nurse slaves did not enter this role voluntarily. Many were enslaved through war, piracy, or birth into slavery. Others were sold due to debt or captured from conquered territories. Once enslaved, their bodies were considered property under Roman law. They had no legal control over their labor, reproduction, or children. Their value was measured by their ability to lactate. Their bodies were treated as tools rather than human beings. Their consent was irrelevant. If an enslaved woman gave birth and could produce milk, she could be assigned as a wet nurse regardless of her wishes. In many cases, her own child was taken away, neglected, or even allowed to die, so her milk could be reserved for the master's infant. Roman writers rarely questioned this practice, viewing it as a natural function of slavery. The emotional toll was devastating. Breastfeeding creates a powerful bond between mother and child. Yet wet nurse slaves were forced to suppress this instinct. They were expected to nurture another woman's baby while grieving the loss of their own. Separation from their children was common. Grief was ignored or punished. Emotional attachment was discouraged. If a wet nurse showed distress, it could be seen as disobedience. Slaves were expected to serve quietly without complaint. Their pain was invisible within Roman society. Physically, the role was exhausting. Wet nurses were required to maintain milk supply regardless of illness, fatigue, or malnutrition. They were often fed just enough to remain productive, not healthy. Their bodies were pushed beyond natural limits, and medical care was minimal unless it protected the master's investment. Illness did not excuse labor. Pain was tolerated, not treated. Recovery was rarely allowed. The Roman obsession with control extended deeply into the wet nurse's daily life. Her diet, sleep, and movements were regulated to preserve milk quality. She could be punished for anything believed to affect the infant's health, even when factors were beyond her control. A sick baby could result in blame, beating, or worse. Wet nurse slaves also faced intense surveillance. They lived under constant watch, knowing that a single mistake could bring severe consequences. Trust was limited and suspicion was constant. Even acts of kindness toward the child could be interpreted as emotional overreach. Roman society justified this exploitation through law and philosophy. Slaves were legally classified as property, not persons. They could not testify in court unless tortured. They had no right to family life. Their suffering was considered acceptable as long as it benefited the household. The law protected owners, not slaves. Abuse was normalized. Resistance was punished. Sexual exploitation added another layer of suffering. Enslaved women were vulnerable to abuse from masters, household members, or guests. Pregnancy could occur without consent, further trapping them in cycles of forced labor and wet nursing. Their reproductive capacity was a commodity, not a choice. If a wet nurse slave gave birth again, she could be forced to nurse multiple children, increasing exhaustion and health risks. Maternal mortality was high, yet rarely acknowledged. A slave's death was an inconvenience, not a tragedy. Even when wet nurse slaves formed bonds with the children they fed, those relationships offered no security. The child belonged to the master's family, not to her. Once the child was weaned, the nurse could be reassigned, sold, or discarded. Emotional attachment offered no protection. Loyalty was not rewarded. Service did not guarantee mercy. Some wet nurses were promised better treatment or eventual freedom, but such promises were unreliable. Manumission existed in Roman society, but it was rare and entirely dependent on the owner's will. Even freed wet nurses carried social stigma and limited rights. Life after service was uncertain. A former wet nurse might be sold to another household, forced into different labor, or used again if she became pregnant. Aging reduced her value, and older female slaves often faced harsher conditions or abandonment. The psychological impact of this life was profound. Constant control over one's body, denial of motherhood, and enforced emotional suppression left lasting trauma. Yet Roman culture offered no space for enslaved women's suffering. Their voices were excluded from literature, law, and historical record. Their pain went unrecorded. Their stories were erased. Their humanity was denied. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of wet nursing slavery is how normalized it was. Roman elites praised the practice as practical and efficient. Philosophers debated milk quality while ignoring the woman producing it. Comfort for the elite depended on the suffering of the enslaved. Wet nurse slaves existed at the intersection of gender, class, and power. They were women in a patriarchal society, slaves in a system built on domination, and mothers denied the right to nurture their own children. Each layer intensified their vulnerability. So why did it suck to be a wet nurse slave in ancient Rome? Because her body was never her own. Because motherhood was stolen from her. Because pain was expected and ignored. Because the law offered no protection. Because her suffering was considered normal. Understanding their lives forces us to confront the true cost of Roman luxury. The empire's greatness was built not only on stone and conquest, but on the silent endurance of enslaved women whose lives were consumed for the comfort of others. Their stories rarely appear in Roman histories, yet they shaped daily life in elite households across the empire. Remembering them does not diminish Rome's achievements. It reveals the human cost hidden beneath them. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones history tried hardest to forget.